Okay, let us begin. So what I want to do is I want to talk about solving some of the blood gas problems. So we're just going to talk about blood gas interpretation. So we'll look at just at the beginning, we're going to look at pH, we're going to look at the CO2 level, and then we're going to look at the bicarb level. So when we're looking at solving a blood gas, where we're talking about an acute, partially compensated or compensated, also known as a chronic acidosis or alkalosis, we need to know our normals. And so that's going to be the crucial part of this, is knowing your normals and setting up your normals. So make sure that you either write your own key. If you don't have this memorized by now, that's okay. Just go ahead and write your own key. And as you start working through these problems, you're going to have a lot better understanding of the normal values. So it's also going to help you practice the normal values as we go through this material. So when we're looking at this information, you just need to take it step by step. Don't let the whole problem, don't let all the numbers throw you off. As long as you're understanding the basics of, hey, this is an acidosis, this is an alkalosis, and which direction, what's pulling the pH in a direction. So we're keying everything off of the pH value. So if the pH is acidic, we need to find what is causing the pH to be acidic. Is it the respiratory because the CO2 is high, or is there lack of bicarb, or where the bicarb level is low? Remember, bicarb's a base, CO2 is an acid. So when we're looking at this, you need to key off of the pH. So we're going to look at the pH first, and we'll label the pH first, and then we'll know if we're dealing with an acidosis or an alkalosis. And keying off the pH, then we can decide what's causing the pH to be in that direction. Now, every once in a while, we'll have a pH that's within normal limits, but we're going to see that the CO2 level or the bicarb level will both be off, especially in opposite directions. So if we have someone that has emphysema, like very significant emphysema, we're going to see that the CO2 levels are going to be high on those individuals. Let's say it's 55. So their CO2 level is chronically high. They're a chronic CO2 retainer. And what's going to happen with their body as a natural response over time is going to create more bicarb to compensate for that acidosis, to compensate for that CO2 level being high. So when we're looking at this, you might see a normal pH, but then you got to decide, well, the pH leans towards the acidic side, even though it's within normal limits. What caused that pH to lean towards that acidic side? Why is this a compensate? Oh, it's a respiratory compensation, or it's a metabolic compensation. So we're going to get into that with the examples, but I just want you to bullet point that we're looking at the pH being the primary thing that we're going to be looking at, and then we're going to try to find what caused the pH to be where it currently is, or what's currently going on with the body's metabolic process. So in this video, I'm not going to go over the oxygenation yet. Let's just start sort of with the very beginning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a blank piece of paper here, and we're going to see. There we go. So when we're doing this, what I really recommend you doing is creating your own key. And that's what I've done up here in the corner. I said, hey, my normal pH values is 7.35 to 7.45. 7.35, anything lower than that is going to be an acidosis. That's why I put that letter A there. Anything greater than 7.45 is going to be basic. That's why I put the B there. CO2 levels, normal is 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. So anything less than 35 is going to be basic, or then anything greater than 45 is going to be an acidosis. Remember, CO2 is a carbonic acid. So a high level of carbonic acid means an acidosis. So that's why it goes sort of the opposite direction. Remember, pH is a negative logarithmic scale. In other words, the lower the number, the more acidic the pH is. So bicarb here, normal is 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. So anything less than 22. Now remember, bicarb is a base. So a high number of bicarb, high value of bicarb is going to be basic. So that's why you see anything greater than 26, we'll label it as basic. Anything less than 22 will be acidic. So we have this going into this, and this will help you sort of, like I said before, drive down normal values or look at normal values. So let's do an example of one of the blood gas calculation. So here I'm going to do a pH of 7.10, CO2 of 80, and a bicarb of 25. So just by looking at this, not by doing anything else, no interpretations yet, is that a normal blood gas value? Well, I would argue it is not a normal blood gas value. So right now we have a blood gas value where the pH is not within 7.35 to 7.45. So what am I going to do? How am I going to go about solving what this blood gas is interpreted? So what I recommend is just using a labeling method. So a pH of 7.10 is considered acidic or basic. Well, let's look over at the our little scale that we drew here. 7.35, anything less than 7.35 is an acid. So we're going to say that this is an acidosis, right? And if you want to, you can go ahead right over here, acidosis. I'm just going to write acid because I don't have a lot of room there. Then I'm going to look at the CO2. Is this normal, high, or low? Is this normal, acidic, or basic? So a CO2 of 80, if we look over here at our scale, a CO2 of 80, that's above 45, so that is also acidic. So I know that there's a respiratory component that's causing the pH to be acidic. Remember, I'm looking at this acidic and this acidic. So I know that that's has a component of causing the acidosis. All right, let's move on. Bicarb. Normal bicarb is 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. This is 25. So this is within normal limits. So I'll just write the letter N here for normal. So here I have an acidosis. So now I need to decide if I have an acidosis, if this is acute or partially compensated. Now it's not compensated because the pH is outside of normal limits. So every once in a while we'll get a blood gas where the pH is normal, like I was talking about earlier with the emphysema example, that where the pH is within 7.35 to 7.45. That's okay. So that pH would then be considered compensated for if the other values are off. But in this situation, the pH is not compensated for. So if you see a pH outside of normal limits, it's either an acute situation where either the CO2 or the bicarb are off and one of them's normal, and then or both of these values are off and the pH is off. So in this situation, when you're looking at the CO2 and the bicarb, are both of them off? They are not, right? So you see that one of them is normal and the other one is not. So when you look at the CO2 and bicarb and see one of them is normal and the other one is not, it is an acute situation. So this is an acute respiratory acidosis. So that's the full write-out, would be an acute respiratory acidosis. All right, I'm just going to shorten it there because I don't have a lot of room. So this would be an acute respiratory acidosis. So just start with labeling, right? Don't go into the whole, okay, I can look at it and just interpret it straight from there. Unless you have a lot of practice behind this, I don't recommend skipping to that step. Once you get your practice under you, then you can start moving forward with it. So let's try another one. I'll try not to talk near as much during this one. So let's do this one, 7.36, a CO2 of 50, and a bicarb of 29. Okay. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to label the blood gas. So pH of 7.36 is, when we're looking over here, 7.35 to 7.45 is normal. 7.36 is normal. However, it leans towards which direction? Normal acidic or normal basic? In other words, it's within normal limits, but which direction, which one is it closer to? Is it closer to being an acid or is it closer to being a base? Well, this one is leaning closer towards being an acid. Remember, it's just barely above 7.35. So what I'm going to do before I move further is just put a sub A in there. Now, you'll see why I do that later on here. Okay, so pH is normal. So that tells me right away this is a compensated blood gas. In other words, if the pH is within normal limit, it's a chronic or compensated blood gas. So someone that has significant COPD, we just talked about before, may have a compensated or normal pH, right? And that's what's going on here. The pH is normal. It does lean towards the acidic side, but it's normal. All right, let's label the CO2. The CO2 is 50 when we're looking at that. CO2 is 50 is greater than 45 over here. So this is acidic as well. All right, and then bicarb of 29. I'm just going to circle these so that way we don't mix them up. A bicarb of 29 is basic. All right, so now I'm going to this. I have a situation here where I have an acid and a base, right? So both of these are going the opposite direction. One is compensating for the other, but how do I decide which one is compensating for which one? Well, this is where the tiebreaker goes to the pH. Which direction does the pH lean? Well, in this situation, the direction leads towards an acidosis. So in this situation, I have a chronic or compensated respiratory, because CO2 represents respiratory, bicarb represents metabolic. So when we're looking at this, I have a chronic respiratory, chronic or compensated respiratory acidosis. Do you guys see this? So it's a chronic, so that CO2 is chronically high. So as a response, that bicarb is going to be high as well to compensate, to buffer that pH, right? Remember, you need the bicarb is one of your body's systems to buffer a pH. So we have a buffered respiratory acidosis. That's why the pH is within normal limits. So I was able to determine that by matching letters up, right? That's why I put the letters there, letter A or letter B. You just match the letters. So if I have a chronic respiratory acidosis, because the pH leans towards the acidic, and so does the CO2. So whatever matches up between bicarb and CO2 with the pH is the culprit, is the cause of the situation. So in both of these examples, CO2 or the respiratory was the cause of their acidosis or compensated acidosis. So that sort of gives us that limit, that way to look at it. Let's do another one. Let's just keep on going down here. 7.58, a CO2 of 30, and a bicarb of 18. Okay. 7.58, 30, and 18. So let's start at the beginning. 7.58 is basic, so I'm going to put a B there. CO2 of 30 is also basic, so I'll put a B there. And a bicarb of 18 is acidic. Okay, so let's break this down. So I have a pH that's an alkalosis. So I have a basic pH, an alkalotic pH. So this is an alkalosis of some sort, ALK. Well, remember what I just said a bit before? I'm going to match up the letters. So in this situation, since the pH is basic, who's causing that pH to be basic? Well, that's the respiratory, right? Remember B and B are A and A, right? So in this situation, both of those are basic. So I have a respiratory alkalosis, right? That's what I get from matching up these letters. So I have a a respiratory alkalosis. Now I got to decide if the pH is within normal limits. We know it's not. So it's either partially compensated or an acute. So what's the difference between the two? Well, an acute situation means between the CO2 and the bicarb, one of those values is normal, the other one's not. Just like we've seen in this first problem up here, one of these values is normal, the other one was not. In this situation down here, they're both going opposite directions. So therefore, they're trying to compensate for each other. So one will be acidic, one will be basic, and the pH will still be off. That's the definition of partially compensated. I'll repeat that again. The definition of partially compensated: CO2 and bicarb will be going in opposite directions, right? One will be acidic, one will be basic, and the pH is still outside of normal limits. So that's what we got going on here. So one of them is acidic, one of them is basic, and the pH is outside of normal limits. So when we're looking at this, this is a partially compensated respiratory alkalosis. I'm just going to have to use short things there. Partially compensated respiratory alkalosis. All right, so we're moving along here. Let's try some more. And the more we do, the more comfortable and confident you'll get with this as well. So let's go ahead to another one. Let's do 7.3854 and 32. So 7.38 is normal. Does it lean towards the side? Yeah, it leans towards the acidic side. So I'm going to put a little A in there too. So it's normal. So in this situation, if all the values are normal, then it's a normal blood gas. But if we look at the CO2 and the bicarb, and they're not normal, they're outside of limits between the CO2 and the bicarb, then we got to figure out what's causing that lean. So let's go to the CO2. The CO2 54, when we're looking at a CO2 of 54, that is acidic. So I'm just going to label it as acidic. And then a CO2 of 32, well, that's very basic. Okay, so I have a pH that leans towards the acidic side, so I'm going to match up those letters. So I have an acidosis of some sort. So I'll just write that down before I forget. An acidosis. So now I need to figure out what's causing my acidosis. So that's just matching letters up. So here I have a respiratory. Remember, CO2 represents a respiratory acidosis, so I'll just write that down. So I have some sort of respiratory acidosis. Okay, now I need to figure out what kind it is. So is the pH normal? Yes. So if the pH is normal and both the CO2 and bicarb are off, we know that this is a chronic or compensated respiratory acidosis. So there are synonyms, chronic, compensated. You can use them either way. So this is a chronic or compensated respiratory acidosis. This would be a very similar blood gas to what you might see with someone that has chronic CO2 retention like emphysema or COPD. All right, so let's keep going. 7.38, so now we'll go to a different one. Let's do 7.44, CO2 of 42. And a bicarb of 22. So remember, at any point you can pause this and work on this your own and then play it and then see if you got it right. So you can use this sort of as a check yourself. So if you feel like you're getting the momentum of interpreting this, test yourself, pause it, right? See if you got it down or not, right? So here, 7.44, it is normal, but it leans towards the basic side. So I'll put N with a little b here, like a sub b. A CO2 of 42, so normal is 35 to 45, so this is normal. And a bicarb of 22, well, that's also normal. So this equals normal values. So you might be thinking, oh, this person's perfect. No need to continue on with evaluating this person. Well, let me give you this situation. Someone with a severe asthmatic episode comes into the emergency department and they've been working hard to breathe. And in the initial stage of an asthmatic episode, they actually go into a respiratory alkalosis because they're trying to hyperventilate to get as much gas exchange as they can when their lungs are shutting down. So when you see a normal blood gas on a patient that's working hard to breathe, I'll repeat that again. When you see a normal blood gas on a patient that's working hard to breathe, then that's a sign that they're going into fatigue. In other words, their respiratory muscles, their diaphragm, their external intercostals, and then maybe accessory muscles are starting to fatigue and tire out. So now they're not hyperventilating anymore. In fact, now they're tiring out. So if you see a normal blood gas, but the patient doesn't look perfectly normal, then it's probably a sign they're going into fatigue, or what we call impending respiratory failure, okay? So this could be a perfectly healthy person. I'm just saying, when you look at a blood gas, don't just assume the patient's just fine. That's the bullet point here. If the patient looks like they're working hard to breathe and you get a normal blood gas out of them, odds are it might be going into fatigue. They might be going into fatigue. All right, so let's try another example here. That was a pretty straightforward one. 7.50, CO2 of 46, and a bicarb of 30. Okay. 7.50 is basic. A CO2 of 46. Ooh, it's just barely above it, but it's acidic, right? 35 to 45 is your normal. And then a bicarb of 30 is basic. All right, basic, acidic, basic. So when we're looking at this, we key everything off of the pH. The pH is alkalotic, so we're going to put an alkalosis, and I'll just write ALK over here. So this is an alkalosis. Now we need to match up who's to blame for this alkalosis. Who's to blame for this pH being 750? Well, that's just where I match the letters up. So that would be the bicarb. So this would be a metabolic alkalosis. All right. Now, since the pH is off, I know it's not chronic. So it's either partially compensated or acute. Well, in this situation, both the CO2 and the bicarb are going in opposite directions, and neither of them are within normal levels. So this is a partially compensated metabolic alkalosis, right? So partially compensated, once again, means that when we're looking at the pH is off, and the CO2 and the bicarb are going in opposite directions. One's acidic and one is basic, all right? So that's what we're looking at here. This meets that definition of partially compensated. So this is just doing them over and over again. All right, let's go on to another one. 7.42, 38, and 26. All right, 7.42 is normal. It leans towards the basic, so I'll label that. CO2 at 38 is normal. And a bicarb of 26 is also normal. So this is a normal blood gas, right? So in this situation, if the patient's working hard to breathe, you might consider something like fatigue is setting in. That's what we call impending respiratory failure. It's impending. It's coming up. They're falling into respiratory failure. They're not quite there yet, right? Because their pH is still normal. All right, let's do another one. 7.30. You can always pause this after I write the gas and then check yourself after I solve it yourself and then check yourself. 7.30. Let's do a CO2 of 52. And a bicarb of 28. 7.30 is acidic. CO2 of 52 is acidic. A bicarb of 28 is basic. So here I have an acidosis. So I'm going to write that down. I have an acidosis. Who matches up with the acidosis? Who's to blame for it? Well, that's respiratory. So they have a respiratory acidosis. Now the question is, since the pH is off, is it partially compensated or acute? Well, in this situation, this would be partially compensated. Partially compensated respiratory acidosis. Why is this a partially compensated respiratory acidosis? Well, between the CO2 and the bicarb, both of them are off, and they're going in opposite directions of each other. All right, when we go, let's do another one. 7.58, it's supposed to be a 5. 7.58, 32, and a bicarb of 18. Let's label it. 7.58 is basic. CO2 32 is basic, right? And a bicarb of 18 is acidic. Yeah. Right? Remember, bicarb's a base, so a low value would mean an acid, right? All right, so overall we have a what? Alkalosis. When we're looking at the pH, we have an alkalosis, so I'm going to write that down. All right, next part. Who's causing the alkalosis? Well, that's where I match up the letters. So when I match up the letters, I see that, hey, my CO2 level matches up with that. So this is a respiratory alkalosis. Now I need to figure out acute or partially compensated. Well, in this situation, both the CO2 and the bicarb are going in opposite directions. One of them is not normal, right? Neither of them are normal in this situation. So this would also be a partially compensated respiratory alkalosis in this situation. Right, so hopefully you're sort of seeing the movement here with all this information. I'm going to keep going. If you need to pause or you think you got it, you can always move on from here. I'll just keep doing examples. And the more you do this, the more practice you do, the better you will be at it. So let's move on to 7.37. Let's do another one here. 7.37. I'll just keep adding on here. CO2 of 38 and a bicarb of 22. So 7.37 is normal, but it leans towards the acidic side. When we look at a CO2 of 38, 35 to 45 is normal. So I'm going to label this one as normal. And then a bicarb of 22 is normal. So this would be a normal value, right? Normal ABG. So we're looking at this. All these are within normal limits. Even though the pH leans in a direction, that's okay. So we need to look at our patient. Remember, a blood gas is only a picture, one small part of what's going on with that patient, right? And especially if we're looking at someone that might be an impending respiratory failure, it's significant if the pH level is normal, right? It's significant because that means that they're starting to fatigue, right? So 7.37, 3822 would be a normal blood gas. Let's do another one. 7.32. Then I got a pH of 32 and a bicarb of 19. So bicarb, well, let's start with the pH. 7.32 is an acid. So we're going to go over here, and I'm just going to write an acidosis, right? I have an acidosis. CO2 of 32 is basic. Well, that's not going to be a respiratory acidosis. We can already see that. And then we got a bicarb of 19. A bicarb of 19. Well, that's a very low bicarb. A normal bicarb is 22 to 26, and low values means an acidic bicarb level. So I have a metabolic. Do you guys sort of see these just matching the letters? I have a metabolic acidosis. Now, when we're looking at this, is this acute, where one between the CO2 and the bicarb, one is normal? No, they're both off. They're going to opposite directions, and the pH is off. So this is a partially compensated metabolic acidosis. All right, so let's do another example. 7.26. 56. and 24. All right, 7.26 is acidic. And I'm just going to go over here and write acidic or acidosis. CO2 56 is also acidic. And then a bicarb of 24, 22 to 26 is normal. So this is within normal limits. So I have when we match up the pH and whatever goes with the pH, that would be the CO2. So this would be a respiratory acidosis. pH is 7.26, and remember the bicarb is normal. So if one of these values between the bicarb and the CO2 is normal, the other one is not, then we know that this is an acute situation. It just happened, so one of them did not get the message yet. So in this situation, the bicarb has not gotten the information yet that they're in an acidosis. It hasn't kicked in yet to start producing to compensate. So in this situation, this would be an acute respiratory acidosis. All right, let's do another one. 7.35, 59, and 30. 7.35 is normal, but it leans towards the acidic side, so that's why I put that in there. CO2 of 59 is acidic. And then a bicarb of 30, 22 to 26 is normal, and this is above 26, so this is basic. All right, so I have a normal pH, and the other two values are off, so I have a chronic something, or compensated something. So who goes along with the direction of the pH? Who goes along with the direction of the pH? Here we see the choice between CO2 being acidic or bicarb being basic. So when we're looking at this, who goes along with the pH? Well, the pH leans. That's the tiebreaker in this situation. You got to look at which direction the pH leans. So in this situation, the pH leans acidic. So this is a chronic acidosis, right? Or compensated acidosis, right? We see that because of the direction the pH leans. Who leans with it? Well, that's the respiratory. So this is a chronic respiratory acidosis. So hopefully it's starting to come together a little bit. I'll just keep doing these, and that's the whole key to this, is just repetition. pH is 7.50. We'll start another one. CO2 of 30. And a bicarb of 23. All right, 7.50 is basic. So I'm just going to go over here and write alkalosis. All right, bicarb of 30, or sorry, CO2 of 30. Normal is 35 to 45, and this is low, and it's an acid. So that would be, if it's low, it's base, right? So I have an alkalosis or basic. So they're breathing really fast. And then a bicarb of 23. Well, normal bicarb is 22 to 26. So this is normal. All right. So when we're looking at this one, we have an alkalosis. Who matches up with that? Well, in this situation, it's pretty straightforward. Right? We're just matching those letters. So I know it's a respiratory alkalosis. And then I need to figure out if this is acute or partially compensated. In this situation, one of them is normal between the bicarb and CO2. One of them is normal, the other one's not. So this is an acute. One of them has got the signal, the other one has not got the signal. All right, so this is an acute respiratory alkalosis, right? So what could cause this? Hey, they've seen a ghost and they're hyperventilating. Who knows, right? But they're breathing really fast and really hard. There are things that can cause it, obviously. I just came up with a silly example for fun's sake. All right, let's do another one, 7.29. CO2 of 40. And a bicarb of 19. 7.29 is acidic. So I'm going to go over here and write acidosis, right? And acidosis. CO2 level of 40 is normal. That's straight normal. And then a bicarb of 19 is acidic, right? This is you going off of your normal values, right? We're just labeling as we go. So obviously I have an acidosis, right? We see that with our pH. Who matches up with that? Metabolic. So I have a metabolic acidosis. Now I need to figure out if it's acute or partially compensated. Hopefully you've seen this seen this before I said anything, but this is acute, right? One of the CO2 and bicarb, one of them is normal, the other one's not. That's an acute situation. All right, let's do another one, 7.50. CO2 of 30. Well, 729. Let's do a CO2 of 46. Let's try this one. CO2 of 46, and then a bicarb of 29. Let's stretch out a little bit here. So 7.50 is basic. So I have an alkalosis. CO2 of 46, just barely above normal, but it still counts as being above normal. So that's acidosis, right? And then a bicarb of 29, that's high level. That is basic. So in this situation, who's to blame for the pH being basic? Bicarb. So this would be a metabolic alkalosis currently. So now I need to figure out if this is acute or partially compensated. Well, both of these values between the CO2 and bicarb are off, and they're both going in opposite directions. So this is a definition of partially compensated metabolic acidosis, alkalosis. I wrote it down there. All right. 7.50, 4629. This is a partially compensated metabolic alkalosis. It's partially compensated because the pH is off, and both the CO2 and bicarb are going in opposite directions. All right. Let's do another one. Ooh, 7.15. That's pretty significant pH there. A CO2 of 68. Yeah, 68. And a bicarb of 18. Oh, heavens. All right. So let's break this one down. 7.15, yeah, that's a very acidic pH. So I'm going to go over here and write acidosis, right? So there's an acidosis going on of some sort. Okay, CO2 of 68, that's also acidic. And a bicarb of 18 is also acidic. Oh, heavens. So what do you write down? If all three of these values are acidic, or let's pretend all three of these values are basic, what do? Well, this is what's called a combined or mixed blood gas. So you won't just write combined or mixed, you got to say which direction it goes. So when we're looking at this, this is either a combined or mixed acidosis. In other words, both their metabolic system is failing as well as their respiratory system is failing. That's causing their pH to be that low. So this would be a mixed or combined acidosis. So you're not saying respiratory and metabolic, you're saying it's a mixed or combined acidosis. Hopefully that's starting to come together. So if all of them were basic, let's say we had a 7.50, CO2 of 20, and a bicarb of 30, all those would be basic, and that would be a mixed or combined alkalosis. So that's what you're looking at here. So you will see these, especially in patients that are where their organ systems are failing. So they're in multi-organ system failure or multi-organ system dysfunction, right? And you'll see that too, where their lungs are failing, their body's producing acid, their bicarb is their kidneys are shutting down, so their ability to produce bicarb. All those things are going wrong, and like a sepsis infection, things like that can lead to that combined or mixed acidosis, right? And you'll most likely see a combined or mixed acidosis more than an alkalosis traditionally out there. let's do one more, and this one will be just fun. You tell me what's going on here. I won't interpret it for you, but at our next meeting time, if you tell me what's going on here, that might mean some good discussion for next time. So this might be a little bit of a research, but let's do this one, and I guarantee you've covered what to do in the situation. So here's the situation. You go into a patient's room, and you draw a blood gas, and you get this blood gas, and the pH is 7.45, and the CO2 is 45, and the bicarb level is 9. How would you interpret this? So this is something I want you to look at. This is not an easy question by any means, but I guarantee you have the means to do this. This is something we did cover in our coursework when we're looking at this one. So hopefully that's something that you can play with. So once again, it's a pH of 7.45, a CO2 of 45, and a bicarb of 9. Bicarb of 9. So that's something that if you want to work on it, I think that's a good discussion point for our coursework. But that's sort of where I want you to be with just sort of going through some troubleshooting. Once again, it's just repetition to get the basics of all this down. So that way you have the basics of understanding a respiratory acidosis versus a metabolic acidosis, or combined condition like a mixed respiratory or mixed acidosis or a mixed alkalosis. When we're looking at this, I want you just to sort of focus on labeling the gas and then writing down, hey, the pH is acidic, this is an acidosis, right? So that's one of your first steps. You're going to write down your normal values, and then you're going to write down, hey, what's the pH telling me? The pH is telling me this is an acidosis. So now I got to find the culprit for that acidosis. And then I'm going to label the CO2. I'm going to label the bicarb and see what's causing that direction to go there. So in another video, I'll also add on PO2. So we're going to look at PO2 and FiO2 as far as mild, moderate, severe hypoxemia, as well as looking at overcorrected, corrected, undercorrected hypoxemia. So that's it for this one, but hopefully it was some useful information to you. And if you want to check yourself, go back and watch this video, and when I'm done just writing down the values without the interpretation, pause it and then see if you can write that value, see if you can do that interpretation right there before we discuss it, right? So then every time I write the pH, the CO2, and bicarb, pause that video and then test yourself. You write down what you think the answer is, right? And then you'll see sort of, am I getting this material? Key in on that pH, write the level of the pH, acidosis, alkalosis, right? Then key on what letter matches up with the pH, right? Respiratory, if the CO2 matches up with it, metabolic, if the bicarb matches up with it. So key on those things, just start practicing and practicing. This is something that you can't just, oh, I get the concept, I'm good to go. This is something you have to practice, and then the light switch will turn on. So let me know if you have any questions, but I think that's it for now. So hopefully you had some practice with this, and we'll work on another one here in the future.